Over the last 25 years, I've had the privilege of interviewing and highlighting some truly interesting people. Everyone who is anyone, both the famous and the infamous, from presidents and their first ladies to kings and queens, movie stars and pop stars, captains of industry, heads of state, sports personalities, innovative entrepreneurs, and some pretty fascinating everyday people. Today, I'm proud to introduce you to Alexander Butterfield, a distinguished military officer, presidential appointee, and aviation executive whose ethical and forthright conduct distinguished his 27 years of federal service. Sir, it really is indeed a privilege and an honor to meet you, Mr. Butterfield.
Well, thank you, Star. I'm pleased to meet you. I've heard a lot about you.
And
And
I feel like I've heard a lot about you, or at least some of the things that you've been involved with, sir.
well, I have had an enjoyable career, a few ups and downs.
As a military officer and presidential appointee of the Nixon administration, you have a unique perspective into his presidency. Why don't you take us back to how you became a part of his administration and that position exactly?
Uh, yeah, that's an interesting story, I guess. First of all, I was an Air Force officer. I loved every minute of my time in the Air Force. And one of my assignments, my last assignment really in the Air Force was in Australia. I had just completed or graduated from the National War College, which is a senior service school, the most senior service school in the armed forces. It's in Washington, D.C. And when I graduated and it's about a 1-year course in national security policy, that sort of thing.
Yes,
And I was assigned to Australia as the senior U.S. military officer in Australia.
Mhm.
So I represented to the government of Australia the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Theater, who was a 4-star admiral. When I first went there, it was Admiral Sharp, U.S. Grant. His name was U.S. Grant Sharp. And following Sharp, the admiral that had that job was Senator John McCain's father, Admiral McCain. So I was his personal representative in Australia and spent my time moving from one outpost to another. Australia is roughly the size of the United States, but it only had 11 million people at that time.
Wow.
Went there in 1967. So that was right about the time that Nixon was running for president against Hubert Humphrey.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been down at the South Pole, the ambassador and several of us from the embassy, on a 2-day visit. We've come back to Canberra, the capital of Australia, where we all lived. We voted for president. I was probably the only guy who voted for Republican Nixon. Usually State Department people in the embassies vote Democratic. I was a Republican in those days. And I'm reading all about Nixon having won the election. And we had just voted a week before in Canberra. Now we see Nixon. I get down to the second paragraph and I see a friend of mine, a very good friend, back when I went to UCLA in 1946, I guess. I was at UCLA, 46 and 7. His name was Bob Haldeman. And this article said he's going to be the new White House chief of staff to the then president-elect Nixon. Well, I now saw what I could do if I had the nerve to do it. So I wrote him a letter and then I took leave, a personal leave, and flew to Washington. Long story short, I had a nice 40-minute meeting with Bob Haldeman. He was glad to see me. Our wives were very close friends. They had only selected 1 or 2 people for their team. It was just at this time when we have President-elect Biden
Yeah.
selecting his cabinet, and this is exactly the time it was for them. They'd selected Henry Kissinger to be the national security advisor. And there are only a few jobs that I could have that were military jobs in the White House. One would be the Armed Forces aide to the president. I was the right rank and all to do that. I was a full colonel. Usually it's a full colonel or a general. And, or I could be the military assistant to the national security advisor, and Henry Kissinger's military assistant, and one other thing, but it was limited, the jobs that I could have. And then he said to me at the door while he's saying goodbye to me, "Why does it have to be a military job?" Well, I didn't want to say because in a year or a little over a year, I want to leave the White House and go to Vietnam. I said, well, I guess really it doesn't. Let me think about that and I'll let you know. So that's the way we left it when I parted. I was committed to thinking about it being a civilian job. I didn't hear and didn't hear and didn't hear. And on the 12th of January, with only 8 days to go before the inaugural, I got a phone call at my home from Bob Haldeman at the Pierre Hotel in New York. I'm in Canberra. And he said, "I'm sitting here next to General Goodpasture." He was a well-known 4-star guy who had worked in Eisenhower's White House. He was a Princeton PhD, 4-star general. Many of us in the military knew of General Goodpasture. And he said, "General Goodpasture here is advising us where military people are concerned. And he's told me that I must have a deputy White House chief of staff. I am going to be Nixon's chief of staff." I hadn't planned to have a deputy, he said, but I'm going to take his advice, and I think you'd be perfect for that.
Wow.
For that, because you've been stationed here. And that's true. I'd been stationed in Washington before. I'd been a military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, McNamara. Gone to the White House every time McNamara went, late at night meetings at the White House. And I had that experience. So that was good for the job he was going to give me.
So I'm going to ask you very specifically, how would you describe your role with the Nixon administration? I know the title was Deputy Chief of Staff, but what was your actual role, sir?
That's right. And you pointed out properly that they are two separate things. We all had our top rung in the Nixon administration was assistant to the president. That's different in all White Houses. It's whatever that White House wants to do it. The top rung in the Kennedy days was special assistant. But with us, it was the assistant. There were 6 of those. We had assistants. The second rung was deputy assistant. We only had a few of those, 3, I think. And I was one of those. And then special assistant. The special assistant were people who had specialties. Well, the speech writers, most of the speech writers were special assistants. Some of the lawyers were special assistants. At any rate, my functions at first, I had to meet the president before I could function, really, if I'm going to be working with the president. And Haldeman kept saying, "He's a funny guy, Alex. I'm going to let you in as soon as I get the feeling that everything is okay." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean." And he said, "Well, Nixon, he doesn't like new people." And I said, I'm thinking, now you tell me he doesn't. I've left Australia. I've left my family in Australia. I got out of the Air Force just the other day. And now you say he doesn't like new people. And he said, "Well, I'm afraid if he sees you without, he has to first meet you. And otherwise you'll spook him." And he said, "Right now, while we're in my office, if he should come in, I want you to stand up, keep your head down, and leave out that door."
Mr. Butterfield, we all know what occurred in the years following. I imagine you've had millions and millions of stories and encounters. But I'm going to jump ahead to probably the most famous word that is associated with the Nixon administration, no matter what he accomplished in his presidency. It will always be known as the Watergate presidency. And so, if you don't mind, I really would love to pick your brain to know, when did it become evident that President Nixon himself was embroiled in the Watergate scandal?
I learned in the middle of April, or in early April of that first year, February, March, April, that the president of the United States was cheating on his taxes.
Really?
And the world that I came from, with the father that I had, honesty was something to be honored. The military was the same way. You know, I don't want to sound like a Boy Scout here.
No, but you know what? Honesty, integrity, trustworthiness, those are all good things to have.
Well, I was actually in disbelief. And yet, as I worked with him, I got to like him. I got to understand him. I never respected him, and I did not vote for him when he ran for re-election, even though I was right there.
Did you end up having to testify to Congress in regards to Watergate?
Yes. Well, yes. I met with the Watergate staff. I certainly didn't want to testify. I liked the guy. I understood him. I was close to him. I can say when I left after that first, and I did do that when the president was reelected. There was a lot of joy in the White House. The only people that weren't smiling were Nixon, who got reelected because he was so. When he took Haldeman and me into the Oval Office and said, "Now we're going to get him. Now we'll get him." He considered having won a second term was going to free him to get all of his enemies and that sort of thing, because this was the hurdle that every president, I think, wants to make. We're witnessing that now.
I was about to say, Mr. Butterfield, you may be taking me through a history lesson, but what you're really doing is giving me a little revelation into what is actually happening presently. Watching, or I should say, reflecting back on our past, literally helps you understand our presence. And it's unbelievable that your testimony literally paved the way for President Nixon's resignation. And so I have to ask you, sir, since you and I both see the similarities, what are the dangers of lawlessness from the executive branch? I feel like I need to ask you, what lessons should we as society take from the Nixon administration?
I don't know how to answer that question, except to say there can be very good things that and sort of evil things about everyone.
And we should be on the lookout that at any given time, either one can rear its head, to be quite blunt with you. Let me just ask you, sir, after the fallout, after you resigned, you did not stay on, we all know, for the second term. And then there was indeed the fallout and the resignation. Where did your career lead you?
To the unemployment line.
Let me just ask you this, because as we're coming to the end, what does the notion of serving your country mean to you personally?
Well, it means everything. I loved it. I happen to love federal government. I don't know city government, county government, or state government the way I know the federal government. But I have worked in a lot of different places in federal government. As I say, went to the National War College. With my assignments, I got to live in 7 different countries, I guess, and 17 states. I loved every minute of it. Every minute of it. I really did. The good times and the bad.
That's not, you know what I have to tell you, Mr. Butterfield? to hear someone say that with your level of humility after everything that you've accomplished, after everything that you've seen, it really does restore my faith in what integrity is. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Star. Thank you.